Hello, everyone, and welcome to July's Historians Lounge episode. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And today we are joined by a returning historian making her second appearance back on the show. Now, if you remember last year, I interviewed this guest, and it was an incredible experience. She is an author, historian, educator, TikToker, and content creator, a jack of all trades. She is an incredible person who specializes in a wide range of different fields, of different topics. But if you follow her on LinkedIn, you may more commonly know her as the professor who combines pop culture and his historical relevancy and context in the modern age. And funnily enough, that is the topic of today's episode: pop culture and sitcom and more, and its relevancy in history and, the world today. And what better guest to discuss this with us today than Professor Meredith Walker. Meredith, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
I'm happy to do it. I always have a good time.
Awesome. So before we dive into this topic, would you like to let our viewers know what you've been up to since the last time we spoke a year ago?
So much. You're right. I am a jack of all trades. I just kind of bounce around between different projects consistently. I don't really know. I don't really know how to stay on one topic, and that's because I have ADHD. So it makes me very good at just jumping from thing to thing as fast as possible. Yeah, I've rearranged my office. If you go back and watch my the old episode I was on last year, it looks completely different. So got new artwork on the walls, new bookshelves up there. That's fun. I needed those desperately because I have an addiction to buying books, and there were way too many of them. Yeah, I've been teaching. I got to teach one of my favorite classes last semester, which was history of American history from 1945 to present. So very like Cold War based. It was a lot of fun. I did a lot of teaching with pop culture in that class. We watched episodes of sitcoms and episodes of The Twilight Zone and Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, just all sorts of really cool stuff that we got to do in that class. I also spoke at my first conference. I did my first presentation at a conference this year. So I went to the the National Pop Culture Association's conference in Chicago in March, and talked about pretty much the topic we're talking about today. So that was a really, really fun experience to get to go to. I'm hoping to go to their conference next year as well, because I've got even more stuff I want to talk about. Next year, I think I'm going to focus on video games. So
Ooh, that'd be a nice one.
Yeah. So it's going to be a really fun thing. And of course, I've got my podcast. I had taken a little hiatus from it, but it's back up again. I'm starting to make more episodes, and working on some really interesting consulting jobs and things like that as well. So I've got a lot of things. I'm spinning a lot of plates, way too many of them really at this point, but hopefully nothing comes crashing down.
Man, you are very, very busy. And before this interview, viewers and listeners, me and Meredith actually did a little pre-discussion on this topic, which is, of course, pop culture and its relevancy and context to, history. And maybe we'll think, well, what's the significance? What's the importance of pop culture in history? It's actually a lot more prevalent than one would think. So, Professor Meredith, I know you've discussed this, written about this numerous times, and if I remember from our last interview, you even talked about how Star Trek was also a reflection of, the world at that time in history. So, as a little opener, from your research, what have you found to be the most interesting thing and relevant things about examining 1950s sitcom and the ones that came afterwards as sources?
I think that it is such an interesting microcosm of understanding the culture that made the media. I've been using things like in my 1945 to present class, we watched episodes of I Love Lucy, and we watched episodes of Father Knows Best and things like that in class. And it is such an interesting thing to watch those episodes and then go to the students before they've even, like, I usually start that out at the beginning of a topic area, before I've given them any like relevant information about the period of time we're talking about. And I say, okay, what do you think this tells you about the time period that this was made in? What does this tell you about the way they viewed women? What does it say about the way they viewed race? What does it say about the way they viewed, working, or things like that? And we talk about those issues, and it really gives the students especially kind of a something to grasp onto that makes more sense to them than maybe some dry academic writing about the period
Right.
of time, right? And that it, I mean, obviously the people who wrote it lived in that world. They are writing about their own experiences or writing about the world that's around them and writing something that they believe will resonate with viewers. And so they have to be kind of in sync with what's going on around them to write effective media. And so it really works as kind of a time capsule, to look at those time periods in that way, where you say, okay, let's see how I Love Lucy was the most popular TV show
Hmm.
on during its time period. The episode that we watched in my class was the episode where Lucy gives birth, and it was the most watched episode of the show at ever, I believe, or at least definitely of the that season and previous
Hmm.
seasons. It was, everybody was watching that episode on television. And there's so many really interesting little factors about that episode that tell you about the culture of the time and how they view gender and things like that. In that episode, Ricky is waiting for Lucy to give birth. He's not allowed to be in the room with her. Today, it's very common for a husband to be in the delivery room with his wife, right? That was not something that was allowed. He was kicked out. He was told to go wait in the husband's waiting room. And he's in there with another man who's also waiting for his wife to give birth. And the guy's complaining about how he's really, really hoping that this next one will be a boy because all of the other ones are a girl. And he's so disappointed when he finds out that he's having another daughter. And it really hits you of like, wow, that's really sad of how disappointed he is to have a girl, and things like that. So it's very interesting to look at just the society that created these pieces of media.
Definitely. And when you look at these shows, like I know I watched a little bit of I Love Lucy, and even add on to that, like the comedy shows of like the 40s and like the late 40s, Abbott and Lou Costello. I mean, those guys
Mhm.
were very, very funny. But as you said, they're like a time capsule of like the history that was happening around them. You know, war was starting around. A
Mhm.
lot of these comedians and actors were making movies for the War Department to get people. There was so many things behind it. And even after sitcoms, the movies that were also showing were also trying to, retain, like the innocence of like the 30s and the 40s. And one thing I'm always interested in is almost like that shift. And of course, the shift referring to like the Cultural Revolution in the United States, like the 50s, 60s, and the 70s. And one thing I'm really interested to talk with you, Meredith, is showmakers like Norman Lear, because I definitely feel
Mhm.
Norman Lear and the shows he created are definitely, some have argued, to be like, the truest reflection of modern America now. So if we viewed Norman Lear's shows as, again, historical sources, what can they tell us about, America and the history then, as opposed to, of course, the shows like Mary Tyler Moore or the Dick Van Dyke Show or I Love Lucy, which were kind of like the late 60s and like early 50s.
Yeah, I think those are really, really good ones. In fact, we watched a couple of episodes of different Norman Lear shows in my class last semester. Specifically, we watched a lot of All in the Family. We watched at least 2 episodes of that, and they were, they're very interesting looks at the society of that time period. Though, to be fair, All in the Family really comes across as, I feel like All in the Family is somehow more relevant today than it was at the
Mm-hmm.
time in many ways. I think that because they were writing they were writing Archie Bunker's character in All in the Family as this incredibly over the top conservative, like, caricature, right? He's
Right.
absurd, he's ridiculous, he's so over the top. And I remember watching the first episode of the show that we watched in my class, and the students just were like horrified because of the really, really politically incorrect jokes that were being dropped, the really politically incorrect commentary
Right.
being made about race, about gender, about just everything. And at the same, I was like, keep in mind, this show was not, Archie's not supposed to be the hero of the show, right? So the things he
Right.
says we were meant at the time to say, oh man, that's horrible. Nobody should believe that. Those are bad ideas. But honestly, I think that conservatives today, I don't want to get too political since we're talking about history, but conservatives today have become like Archie Bunker, and it's really hilarious to watch that happen. Because they've adopted all of the same ideas as a person who is supposed to be a joke, who is supposed to be a caricature, and I think that's really interesting. So that was a really big thing that came up when I was teaching that episode, because students were like, "Wow, that's disturbingly like still relevant. Everything about this is so relevant today." So it's a really interesting way to commentate on modern events as well. Um, but yeah, Norman Lear did a really great job commenting on so many pieces of the cultural revolution that were ongoing, the kind of problems that were being seen between the conservative older generation and these younger, hippies, these people who are coming up and wanting a better world, wanting to change things, and Archie Bunker's generation of saying, well, everything was fine when I was a kid, and everything was great, and I don't see why we need to change anything. And it really captures that particular period of American tension, I think, very, very well.
Definitely. And also around that time, of course, there was the censorships that in those shows, that what they could say and what they could not say were also reflections of history at that time. And then, I was watching this video a while ago about, the comparisons of like media in terms of like, the type of character that would appear in said media. And it's really, really fascinating. And I may be jumping ahead, but I think it is important to talk about, which is, okay, one popular trope that's usually in a lot of shows is, some form of like drug abuse or alcoholism. And while that wasn't prevalent or did not show at all in, the shows of the 1950s at that time, because they wanted to preserve, the nuclear family, what they imagine as the family, shows like Norman Lear, they touched on a little bit of that. But, through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a lot of that was becoming, much more prevalent. And one aspect that was discussed in the video is like, where does sort of like the cultural shift, where in those shows, rightly so, they were vilified, that things like we shouldn't be promoting this. But now with modern media, there are so many shows that are focusing on characters in those societies, in those cultures, and they're supposed to be the hero or even anti-hero. So in your research, like, what's like the importance and significance of like studying like that aspect of media history?
Right, like the shift. Well, I think that, like I said, the shift is about, it shows how society is shifting, right? So when you get into the 80s or 90s, and you're watching the things like Saved by the Bell or Fresh Prince of Bel-Air or things like that, right? And there's a lot of that, like dare, don't do drugs, don't do this,
Right.
that's going on, which was very common at the time. I remember, McGruff, the crime dog. I remember all the don't do drugs things coming to my school, right? That was a big part of the 1990s. And now our society is shifting towards this idea that, pot's not going to kill you. Pot's not going to, make you turn into some sort of evil, like druggie that's gonna go after everybody. And so as a result, our media has shifted to show that as the society view, right? Which is that drugs are not necessarily bad. Like, they can be bad, but they aren't necessarily going to cause, the fall of civilization, the way that the 90s and early 2000s shows were. So you see shows like Euphoria or things like that are showing a lot more drug use, and showing a lot more drinking, showing a lot more partying and things like that. And they're not necessarily showing it in a positive light, but they are showing it in ways that are less negative probably than the 80s
Right.
and 90s would have ever gotten away with. And so it really just shows how media in a general sense just shows the shift in society over time, and that time capsule effect of saying, okay, yeah, compare, if you took an episode of Euphoria back to the 1950s, I think you would cause somebody to have an actual heart attack.
Yes.
Like there'd be a stroke would happen. And so it is very, very interesting to look at that and understand how different society has become over time. When we go back and watch an episode of Father Knows Best today, instead of it being a popular TV show, we look at it and say, that's horrible. Everything about this is so throwback, and it's so disturbing to watch now, and to understand how much in just 70 years our society has shifted. And to see that is really amazing, to see that, yeah, it's not okay to tell girls that you can't be an engineer. Girls don't get to do that. Like, you can't say that to people in TV shows anymore,
Right.
because it's crazy to say girls can't do X, or girls can't, be single or decide to have jobs outside the home. We don't say that anymore in media, because that's a throwback. We don't believe that anymore. And so that's really an interesting shift that we're seeing.
Definitely. And also around that time, like, cartoons, especially in like the late 50s, 60s, especially now in the 70s and 80s, where they became much more prevalent. They were always trying to, be very, very, family friendly. Like the Saturday morning cartoons, like everybody remembers the Saturday morning cartoons. That was like the funnest thing. But then as time went on, cartoons actually started becoming more like sitcoms, where we were telling, more mature stories, but they weren't, overtly adult, but they didn't dumb down to the audience. And I look back now, like shows like from my generation, like Static Shock, Justice League, Batman, those were pretty dark shows looking back on it, but somehow they were able to make a show that children can watch. And I think it's also really important discussion to know media for like kids. So in your research, Professor Walker, did that also come about, the media consumption of the youth from when the first cartoons or even like the first sitcoms appeared to media now?
Yeah, I haven't focused a lot on children's media. I've mostly been focusing on media made for adults.
Okay.
But just speaking from my own personal experience, I mean, I remember watching, like you said, Static Shock. Like, they dealt with a lot of things that were pretty heavy in dealing with even things like racism and things like that within the context of a children's show. And I think that's really interesting. But that being said, you go back to some of the cartoons from the 80s, and if you rewatch them, if you rewatch like old Transformers stuff, and you're like, wow, this was dark. This was for kids? What was going on here in this?
Right.
Right. And so sometimes you see that, you go, wow, they weren't dumbing things down for the kids at all. And I wasn't watching the 80s cartoons when I was a kid, but my older sibling is 12 years older than me. So of course I still ended up engaging in a little bit of the reruns of Transformers and things like that. And so, it's very interesting to look at children's media. I haven't done a lot of that, and I probably should delve into that a little bit more in future research, just to see how that's shifted. But it's not something that I focused on exclusively or seriously with my research at this point. Yeah. But I can definitely see that it has a lot of relevance. One of my students in my class last semester, she wrote her final paper for my class on children's media, specifically like PBS. We were talking about the rise of public broadcasting and how that affected children's education and things like that. And so she was focusing a lot on things like Sesame Street and things like that, not necessarily cartoons. But it is really interesting to see how that affected children going forward, and not just in education, though that was obviously a main area. Like, how did it affect their ability to read? How did it affect their interest in education and things like that? But also just that Sesame Street was, quote unquote, very woke, very from the beginning, right? Where you start to see them dealing with major issues of different races, poverty, all of those things within the context of that show, and that had a major effect on the way that the next generation of children would grow up and look at society around them, and look at people of different skin colors and look at people of different economic backgrounds and things like that, because as a child they watched a show that said, hey, all of these people are worthy of respect and all of these people should be treated with decency and things like that. And that's going to have a major effect going forward, because especially in childhood, that's your most formative years. So that was a really interesting paper that she wrote. I was really, she did a great job. She got an A. She did a great job on that paper.
Nice.
But, it was a fantastic look at that. And so yeah, children's media does, I think, deserve a lot more attention than it probably gets in academia, simply because of how impactful it is on children, and how it changes the future generations and how they go on to change the world, essentially. So it's more of a, I would say, that's something from a more sociological perspective. Sorry, I bumped my desk.
No problem.
And less a historical, because I look at children's media in the way that how is it going to affect the future rather than how it affects the past, in many ways. But
definitely. And also, another thing I want to discuss, going back to what talking about before, like the family dynamic, the nuclear family. One thing, looking back now, that was really like ahead of its time, which is the show Fuller House. And the reason I bring well, not Fuller House, but Full House, is that if you really look at it, like, of course you have Lori Loughlin and the cast, but her character, I imagine, didn't really come into the picture until much later, and it was just the three guys that were raising this family. And I think that is an aspect that is also up for discussion, because I remember in another video that I was watching how someone examined that, where it's like Full House is an examination to show that the family nucleus can still, survive, because he was making the argument that, in media, the wife, the woman is the head, or like the binder of the family. And what happens when you remove that glue of the family? Does it disintegrate? Does it fall apart? I'll give an example with Archie Bunker in the episode with but it's where his wife unfortunately does pass away, and he falls apart, but he manages to recover and still go on. So I think that there's also like something to discuss around that as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially when you start to look at that media, that interest especially becomes prevalent in the 80s and 90s, where we start to see a lot more diverse family structures being shown in media, and that reflects the fact that there was a lot more diversity of family structures happening at that time, right? The divorce rates are going up, so we're seeing a lot more blended families. We're also seeing a lot more single parents and things like that during that time period, especially single mothers. And we're starting to see you start to see a lot of television shows through the 70s, 80s, and 90s that begin to show that blended family structure, and show that you don't have to have a traditional family, that to have a loving family, to have a supportive family, a successful family, that you don't need the nuclear mom, dad, and 2.5 kids to make success. And again, going back to things like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, right? Like this is while that is a traditional family, right? There's a traditional family, they're wealthy, they're in a, they live in a great house in Bel-Air, but you bring in this main character who is just a side, he's the cousin, right? But he's the main character, and they bring him into that family. And yeah, there's lots of crazy hijinks and stuff, but there are so many great episodes showing Uncle Phil, who is not related to Will at all. He's his, he's an in-law basically, but treating Will as his son, treating him in that fashion, comforting him, guiding him, all of those things. The episode of the show that we watched when I was teaching this was the episode where Will and Carlton get arrested because they're driving a fancy car.
Yes, I remember that episode.
And the episode's hilarious, but also very serious, talking about issues of race and police brutality and issues like that. But my favorite scene is the scene where his uncle shows up and is like, you don't let my kids out. And he doesn't refer to him as my son and my nephew. He said, those are my kids, right? Those are my kids. You're going to let them out. Those are my boys. And you haven't, you have not done your due diligence. They're minors. You talk to them without their parents. We're their parents. And
Yes.
it's such a very strong moment because of the way that it shows clearly that Uncle Phil views Will as his own kid. And that's, a very powerful moment for a show like that, to show a blended family in that fashion. And Full House definitely did a great job with that, where you, especially like you said, there's 3 men who are raising these kids, and at the beginning of the series, and it's, they're doing a good job, at least a fairly decent job, right? I mean,
Yeah.
obviously they're going to make mistakes, but all parents make mistakes, whether there's a mom in the picture or not. And you get to really see that happening, where you get to see, I think it kind of goes back to that phrase, it takes a village, right? Where this idea that you can't necessarily just rely on you and your wife to raise your kids. Sometimes you need people around you to be involved as well. You need your family, you need your community to be involved.
Definitely. And also, one thing I do want to discuss with you is almost like, we talked about before, like, the shift in media, like how it's changed over time. But there's one thing that I did want to discuss with you in terms of, in modern media now, they always, of course, reference, what's happening in the real world outside of that show's, universe. In the case of, Friends. Friends ran for a very, very long time. But there's one episode which I found really interesting that's never really explored is, of course, and this is going to be just fair warning, I'm going to say it as best I can, the tragedy that was September 1st. Everyone remembers that.
September 11th,
yeah. Remembers that like horrible day. It's ingrained in everyone's mind. But what I found interesting is that Friends never talked about it. And there was never mention of like what happened. But for me, the reason I bring this up, viewers and listeners, is that I view that almost like a shift where shows can talk about real world tragedies and bring it into, the shows. And sometimes some shows do a good job at it. Other shows do not. So in your opinion, Professor Walker, do you think that pinnacle moment in United States history really changed the American media forever?
It did in so many ways, and not just television or film. I mean, the music industry was just a huge, had a huge shift that affected that. And Friends, I will note, I can't remember which episode it was specifically, but I believe it was the first episode of the next season after 9/11 happened. Or one of the episodes right after 9/11 happened, they they specifically dedicated one of the episodes to like the fire, like first responders. So they didn't mention it within the context of the episode. It was just kind of a thing at the beginning or the end of the episode that they dedicated the episode to them. So they did reference it, but very, very vaguely and things like that. But a lot of TV shows, of course, came out during that time period that became very, very popular. So there was a lot more shows focusing on first responders that became popular after that point, where there's a lot of TV shows dealing with New York firefighters and New York first responders. And of course, I mean, look at shows like 24 that came out during that time period. And 24 came out literally right after. That's when it started. It started in 2001. And I remember reading an article once where it was the show creator or one of the producers was talking about the fact that he believed that the show was going to get killed after 9/11 because nobody was going to want to watch a show so dark. Because the first season had been filmed well before 9/11, right? So they weren't filming it in the context of that. And then it wasn't. It was wildly popular. It went on for season after season after season because people liked the kind of gratification of watching the American like security apparatus do its job. Or watching Jack Bauer torture people. Like people enjoyed that a lot, which really brings to question issues of of things that were ongoing at that time period, which were which was torturing people at Guantanamo Bay, the torture that was being done by the CIA and people like that during that time period. So it really addressed a lot of that. Though I think one of the best examples of the change that happened during that time period has to be Star Trek Enterprise, which I wrote my master's thesis on Star Trek. And Star Trek Enterprise had a rapid shift after 9/11. They went in a very, very jingoistic, heavy-handed kind of way to address those issues. And it was a little scary, because Star Trek, in my opinion, had never been about those kind of dark impulses. It was always about the positives and like seeing humanity try to be its best self. And if you watch those seasons, those later seasons of Enterprise, you have the captain torturing people. You have him, like basically waterboarding a prisoner in an episode, and showing it as a positive, showing it as this is an okay thing to do because this is a bad guy. So it's okay to torture him for information. And torture specifically, I talk about this a lot when I teach. It's so weird when I get to that period of American history when I'm teaching it, because it's the first time you have to teach a class about historical events that you were alive for, like my students weren't. Most of my students are young, but I was alive. I remember these events, I was there for it. It's very odd to teach 9/11 and the ensuing, American freedom fries and all of that debacle of that period of time. But it is just a little scary to realize how positive we viewed things like torture and things like that during that time period. Like we were not very critical about what we were watching in our media. And a lot of the media that you look at during that time period is propaganda. It's propaganda being created to encourage us to view the security apparatus as good, and to say, yeah, it's okay for them to do all these over the top, quite frankly, constitutionally unconstitutional actions, because, well, in the end, they're protecting us, right? And that it's very odd to realize how much media serves as propaganda when you look at that. And then that made me look back at media from previous decades and say, how much of this was propaganda? How much of this was an attempt to kind of tell us how to think about things? And that that makes you question everything about media in a great way.
Definitely. Another thing also to discuss as another shift in media is also, shows about, cops and like the police, because I think that's also a huge shift. Like, I forgot the name of that show during the phase that was about cops, but also like Green City Blues or like something Blues. Of course, Law and Order, the original SWAT. Law and Order SVU, which came out afterwards. And then even from there, you had The Rookie, which is more recent, Rookie Blue, NYPD Blue, which I started watching, and it's a great show. But the reason I'm bringing this up for you listeners is that is also a shift in, the representation of, how the police has been depicted in media as well. And I definitely feel Law and Order was like also another shift in the presentation of media, because anyone who's watched the old school, I'm not talking about SVU, the newest one, which arguably some say more popular, but the original Law and Order by Dick Wolf, that series in the beginning brought up some of the most vile real world cases that affected the state of New York and the city of Manhattan itself. And that is interesting, like how we view media, because now if you look at modern media now, what's more popular? You have cop shows, which can be divulged into various subgenres. You have, of course, the family sitcoms. You have food channels, which we didn't even talk about yet.
Right.
And of course, reality TV shows. And we'll touch upon that a little bit later, because that's also a huge thing. But for you, Professor Walker, why is it also important to also sort of like examine, the evolution of, the police in media? Because that is also a huge shift. Because as you said, like characters like Stabler, who was very, very aggressive in SVU, now his character has been sort of reworked to fit the modern viewer audience, where, as you said, he can't do what he did or his character did in the beginning, he has to change because, you know, policing has evolved in the show, as the characters have said. So why do you think it's also important to explore that aspect of American media as well?
Oh yeah, it's absolutely hugely important. I think one of my favorite cop films, not a TV show, but is In the Heat of the Night, which obviously was, Poitier. This is a fantastic film looking at policing in the South, right? And it's dealing with race and all of the things that are going on there. And then you look at, like Law and Order, which is made, decades later, and it takes a very different tack on looking at the police. Because if you watch In the Heat of the Night, yeah, you've got Sidney Poitier's character, who's a good cop, right? He's down there, just happens to be in the area, and he gets pulled into this, investigating this murder in the South, and he has to, deal with race. And so he's viewed very positively in the movie. But when you look at the other cops in that show, they are definitely highlighting the negative, right? That the police don't necessarily want to solve the crime. They just want to get somebody arrested. They just want to get this over with and, shove it under the rug, right? And Sidney Poitier's character is not going to let that happen. He wants to dig into this and find out the truth. But you notice that they show most of the cops in that movie are shown in a pretty negative light. We're not meant to kind of side with them. Obviously, the chief of police, he has this kind of come to Jesus moment, and it does a better job over the course of the film. But the rest of the cops, the rest of the people working in the department are not the best. And then you look at shows like Law and Order and how positively they view the cops and how positively they show the cops. I used to be a big fan of cop shows. I watched a lot of police procedurals. I was a big fan of them. And I just can't watch them anymore, mostly because I have become so cognizant of the propaganda aspect of them, of television in general, but certainly of cop shows. And I think a really, really great episode of John Oliver's show Last Week Tonight. He did an entire episode talking about Law and Order, which is something I highly recommend people watch, because he really delves into the history of the show and the motivations behind it. So it's a very, very excellent episode to watch. But it's propaganda, and that's not even me making that up. Like, Dick Wolf has admitted, he has said that Law and Order is cop propaganda to show that cops are good and cops do the right thing and cops are always, trying to do what's right, and you should cooperate with them and do these things. And that's not really reality, right? That's like they're showing a very whitewashed version of police. I will say I still really like Brooklyn Nine-Nine. That's one of my favorites. But they did a really good job of addressing some of those things. Like, you have an entire episode dealing with Terry being racially profiled by another police
I remember
officer,
that episode.
right? And the last season really dealt with issues of the post 2020 kind of view of cops after the George Floyd riots, where they really started to address those issues. And I think that's beneficial. Like, that's one of the reasons I still enjoy Brooklyn Nine-Nine, because they were very, reflective. They were very self-reflective on the issue of policing in that show, despite it being a comedy essentially. And but you look at a lot of these shows. One of my favorites for a very long time was Rizzoli and Isles. Love it.
Yes,
it's a good cop show.
I love that
it's
show
got
as well.
A strong female character. I loved it. But recently, this was probably a couple of years ago, I tried to rewatch the show, because I like rewatching stuff. It's my comfort show, And I watched the first episode again, and I had to stop after the first episode, because in it, it's not giving anything away. The show was on a long time ago, but she's abducted by a person who had previously abducted her, right? She has PTSD from this. She has him on, she fights back. She gets away from the serial killer who's trying to kill her, and she has him on the ground. He's helpless, right? She has him on the ground. She could arrest him. She could tie him up. She could do whatever she needs to do.
I know the episode you're referring to.
And she shoots him through the hands. And it was such a... I remember watching it the first time when I was like in my early 20s and being like, yeah, good for her. She got that guy back. Like, he did horrible things to her, and now she's ruined his hands because he's a surgeon. And like, it's very, very, very big deal for her to do this. Watching it in my 30s, I was like, that is police brutality. That was unnecessary. Yes, she has trauma. She has PTSD. He did try to kill her, but she has him on the ground. She's not defending herself. She just does a brutal thing to him to get her to get back at him. That's not okay. That should have gotten her fired. She should have lost her job after the first episode of the show started, because that was not professional. She should not have done what she did. And they never address that. It's never addressed as a bad thing. It's never addressed as her doing the wrong thing. It's always addressed as, yeah, he deserved that. She should have done that. He was a bad person. And that bothered me deeply. It bothered me deeply. And it made me start looking at some of the other cop shows I used to watch and realize how much of those shows are targeted towards the idea that it's okay when the police violate your constitutional rights, because they're just doing their job. They're trying to protect people. It's okay if they search your house without a warrant, or they, casually beat somebody up, because, in the end, they were probably doing it for the right reasons, and that guy was probably the bad guy. How often are the people that the police actually brutalize actually the bad guys in real life? But in TV shows, 95% of the time, they're actually right when they do what they're doing, right? And that bothered me deeply when I started to realize that. And I said, I can't really watch. And I think cop shows are becoming a little less popular these days since 2020. I think that there's been a downturn in the number of cop shows that are being watched and being made. I'm seeing a lot more shows about private investigators now, which I find really interesting. So we're shifting that direction where we still want the crime shows, but we want stuff like The Lincoln Lawyer, or we want stuff like Sugar or things like that are coming out that are about private detectives. And
Equalizer
I think that's
and Tracker.
Yeah. We're saying, okay, yeah, we still want that violence. We still want the relief of watching the good guy get the bad guy, but we're having questions about the cop narrative, right? That. And so we're starting to see that shift, I think, in a lot of stuff. And I will say that my current fun show that I watch in the background is 911 and 911.
I love that show.
I don't have a problem with those, because there are cops involved in those shows, but they're mostly about first responders. I don't have a problem with firefighters. Like, firefighters are cool. They haven't done anything to me, right? I don't feel like firefighters are going to do anything that's going to make me not like 911. But I really like watching those shows, and they're pretty self-reflective on issues of police brutality and things like that as well when it comes to that. So I've really enjoyed watching that more than cop shows these days. But
definitely. And also we're talking about, in going back to cop shows, the realm of characters that if this character existed in real life, he would have been removed, is a character of Vought from Chicago PD. Anyone who's watched that show, there are instances where it's I'm pretty sure if this was real, he would have lost his job and have been fired. And one episode I'm going to give an example to is his colleague whose kid gets kidnapped. And the wife says, I know you tried to stay away from Vought. I know you tried not to do his way, but I don't care. Get our son back. And if you know the episode I'm referring to, he literally gets a chain, wraps it in his hand as a chain brass knuckle. It's okay, yeah, this. But to your point, as you were saying, he's and the hero in this scene, how it's played out, he wants to find his kid and he doesn't care what he has to do it. So it is really interesting, the shift, from the beginnings of the original SWAT, where it's they want to, follow the character, follow the law, but still be entertained, because that's ultimately the thing about television. It needs to be entertaining. It needs to grab people. But I think now, in case going now to the medical shows like Grey's Anatomy, the ER, New Amsterdam, The Good Doctor, all those shows, that is also, a shift popular, where you've seen doctors, following within the rules of, their oaths. In a case of Grey's Anatomy, and sorry for fans of Grey's Anatomy, again, that's also kind of a fictional representation of, doctors,
very
nurses,
much so,
surgeons. it's like there are instances where it's like, okay, if this was real life, any of these characters would have been fired because there are some instances where they've broken their oath, they've bent the rule to suit what they believed to be the correct thing. So ultimately, from what we've talked about, like this shift where it's like, media was presented in the way that it was at the time. And now it's like going back to what you're saying, how we're trying to make shows, still have that feeling of like, okay, nostalgia, that it harkens back to a show that we have liked before. But sometimes it's not really the case. And why do you think that is from a historical perspective? Like, okay, in the case, the remake of Fresh Prince that was done, as well as the remake of One Day at a Time. Like One Day at a Time, family is still the same on Netflix. The only difference is it's a Cuban family living in Florida. Some of the situations may have been altered to fit the characters, but normally it still stays the same. So what can you also tell us also about like that? Like, what is the historical significance of shows like that, where it's the same show that people may have remembered like 30 or 40 years ago, but it's also not, and it's trying to cater to a new audience?
Yeah, I think that is there's multiple things to analyze with that, and one of them is the complete allergy that media seems to have today to making anything new. And that in itself is a whole area to analyze, right? This idea that if you look at Hollywood, if you look at television, the complete lack of new things, everything is based on previous IP, right? Everything is old intellectual property that's being rebooted and redone, and usually not as well. Like, it's just not, they're relying on nostalgia to get people in their seats. Like, but last night I went to see a movie. I was on a date. I went to see a movie. There was 2 trailers before the movie. One of them was the new Ghostbusters movie. It's coming out, right? So, and I have no interest in seeing it. I saw the last one before this. It wasn't good. The whole thing was just like nostalgia. It was a nostalgia pull. That was all it was. And so I have no real interest in seeing it. The next trailer was another Godzilla movie. And so both of these are based on existing IP that have been made for decades, right? And they're not making anything new. There's just nothing new coming out. And I find that very odd. Like, it's just a very strange thing where they just want to make stuff that, well, it was successful then, so hopefully it'll be successful now, right? It's about money. The whole thing is just a money grab at that point.
Right.
But also, I think the popularity or lack of popularity for reboots is, it does tell us something about society, which is that, a lot of people have said they don't want to watch the new Fresh Prince of Bel-Air or the new One Day at a Time or things like that. And that tells us something about the kind of the pushback against woke in America, right? Like, there's a lot of people who are saying, I don't want to watch this because they're remaking it just to make them Cuban or whatever. And that's like, if you don't want to watch the show, don't want to watch it for a good reason, not because you don't like the race of the characters. That's ridiculous. Like, that's not a good reason to not watch a show. That it's unoriginal or that it's badly made maybe is a good reason not to watch a show, but if you're not watching it because they changed the race of the characters, like, that says something about you as a person, right? I just think about like the new Little Mermaid when it came out, and I was like, I didn't go see it because I wasn't a fan of like the production or the director or several other things. It had nothing to do with the race of Ariel. But then there's all these people who are mad about the race, about them changing the race of Ariel. And that is that media, it's not the media telling us about society, but the reaction to the media that's telling us about society. So I think that's really interesting as well, where we can look at it and say, okay, yeah, there's something seriously wrong in American society when there's a huge subset of people who are mad about the race of a fictional character. That's a little weird. Maybe don't be upset about that. It's a strange thing to be upset about in the year of our Lord 2024. Like, calm down. But yeah, it tells us a lot about society, I think. But yeah, there's a lot of remakes being made recently, and I think that most of it is just, it's economic fear from Hollywood. They only want to make stuff that they think is already popular and will get people in seats. So you see, like, new Mission Impossible movies, new remakes of old TV shows, things like that are being made, and we're not really seeing much new because they don't want to take a chance. They don't want to take a chance on new media because, well, it's harder to get people to come in and watch a film. I mean, even the movie I went to see last night, I wasn't going to see a new movie. I went to see a revival of Wrath of Khan. Like, I went to see an old Star Trek movie. So, which is a fantastic film. Everybody should see it if they haven't. But it's just one of those moments where it's like, yeah, I don't go see new stuff. I do go watch old stuff. It's true. I do that. So yeah.
Nice. And also, before we get to like the very end, I think there's another thing to talk about, which is, this thing that I think we've touched on a little bit, we haven't really explored. So in your professional opinion, Professor Walker, would you say in terms of like American media and its ties to the culture of the time that it existed in, do you think that art reflects culture or the culture creates the art?
I mean, I think it's both in a way. It's kind of a feedback loop. And I think we have to, when you're looking at media from the past, it's very important to not just look at the media. You need to look at the surrounding stuff. I mean, one example, I think, let me see if I can find the book really quick. I think I have the article, the paragraph bookmarked. 1 second. Right. So when I was working on my topic of my conference paper this year, one of the books that I was reading was this book that was published in 1947. Which is a book that was a bestseller at the time and was nominally responsible for encouraging women to leave the workforce and go back to being housewives, right? And in this book, let me see if I have it bookmarked because I quoted it in my paper, so I probably do. Basically, there's a section in here, right here it is. Government and socially minded organizations should, through propaganda, make it clear that pursuits outside the home are not generally desirable for women. Solely in the public interest, the disordered fantasies of the masculine complex women should be combated insofar as those fantasies are advanced as the proper basis for public policy toward women as a whole. The emphasis of prestige, honor, subsidy, and public respect should be shifted emphatically to those women recognized as serving society most fully as women. Discrimination all along the line should be shifted in their favor. So basically, this book is encouraging the creation of propaganda that tells women that the only way they can be fulfilled is to be housewives. And then you look at the media that's created in the 1950s, and you see that they got exactly what they wanted, right? And so those TV shows in the 1950s, they didn't reflect reality. They didn't. Not if you know the history of the 1950s, huge numbers of women were working outside the home. There were single mothers. There was a very diverse, actually, world out there. But if you look at 1950s media, you might be fooled into thinking that the world really was these white picket fence houses and, perfect housewives, right? And that was the way women were and the way women wanted to be. And so when we look at it, we really have to look at what purpose did the media serve? And things like that. So we have to kind of analyze it from multiple angles. And I think that confuses people often. So I kind of lost the train of my thought here. 1 second. I'll gather it back. It's the ADHD, it does that. But basically my point is that there's a feedback loop. So culture does create media, and it does reflect on it reflects on the culture that is making it as well. It's both. But at the same time, we have to analyze the purpose of the media too, to understand what it's reflecting and what the media is saying. It's not just as easy as saying, let's watch this TV show and then we'll know what the 1950s or the 1960s or the 1970s was like, because we need to know who made it and why they made it and what was the purpose, right? What was their goal with this television show? So you look at something made by Norman Leir, you have to look at Norman Leir in the perspective of he was a very liberal man. He had a very particular viewpoint that he was espousing in these shows, and you have to take that into account as you analyze the content, right? And understand that it does reflect society, but it reflects society the way Norman Leir wanted to reflect society. So that matters a lot, I think, in how we analyze media, and it gets very complicated, but I think that's why it's so fun to do, because there's so many little different ways to look at it and so many different angles to analyze from.
Definitely, and almost like an ending point to like this really, really powerful discussion, which is very fascinating because someone would say, going back to what we said, like media and history, like was it significant? Well, this is a significant for viewers and listeners because it is a reflection of the time period that it existed in, but it's also a way to show like how certain topics were explored in media. You can talk about one aspect of the family dynamic and how they have evolved over time. And just as Professor Walker said, how did the creators view the family from their own lenses? Norman Lear, how did Norman Lear view, the different families of the different shows he created to where they're all distinctly unique? They're not the same, but they still have that Norman Lear touch. Same with Dick Wolf and the shows that he created, and shows like, of course, Blue Bloods, which talked about a cop family, and other great shows. And we're not saying that you couldn't watch these shows. I mean, everyone can enjoy whatever they want to watch. But it's
Absolutely.
always important to, if you're viewing this as an historian and this is your field, it's really imperative to really understand, okay, what can the show tell me beyond what I'm seeing? What was the world that this show was geared towards, like, say, NYPD Blue? In the case of Andy Sipowicz, is probably the character who, when he appeared, very much of a brigand, very much initially as an unlikable character. And what happened? He became probably the most beloved character on the show. Did he still have some of his tendencies? Of course, but he worked to become a better person, which if you looked at his journey as a character, that is something I think at the end of the day, when media can be used for a positive message to show that there are characters who exist in the real world who struggle with this, but with the people around them, they can grow to become better human beings. Because what happened at the end of that show, he not only became a sergeant, he also became the leader of his squad, even though a lot of people did not want him because he said, you have to play by the rules. It says, like, I'm not playing by the rules. I'm still going to follow my oath as an officer, but I'm not going to play your rules. I'm going to play the rules of the badge that I honor and protect. And ultimately, that is really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, if you look at things like the Dirty Harry movies, right, where
Yes.
he understands that the things he's doing are wrong. He's doing them and he knows they're wrong, because at the end of the movie, he hands in his badge. He says, I can't be a police officer anymore after I did what I did. I did what I thought was moral. I did what I thought I needed to do, but I also know that I violated the rules. And I would love to see that more often in media. But in general sense, I think the thing that I want people to take away from my like studies of this is that media literacy is so important. It's so important to understand what it is you're watching, because if you just consume media with no criticality at all about what you're watching, you're just absorbing those ideas. You're just absorbing propaganda, and it's all propaganda. It all is. Even if it's propaganda you agree with, it's still propaganda, right? And it's you're being fed ideas, and you need to understand what those ideas are, and you need to understand the society that's making them and understand what point they're trying to make. And I think having seen Wrath of Khan last night, I just made a TikTok video about it where I think it highlights media literacy, the importance of media literacy so much, which is that I don't know if you've seen Wrath of Khan, but in Wrath of Khan, Khan quotes a book multiple times. He quotes Moby Dick. And he clearly had read this book a lot. He read it and understood and quoted from it multiple times. The problem is he missed the complete meaning of the book, right? The meaning of the book is that crazed revenge, right, is going to end in tragedy. You're going to end up dead if you just dedicate yourself to revenge for no reason. It's the whole point of the book. And then what does he do? He dedicates himself to revenge and ends up killing his entire crew and himself. And he clearly had read the book, but he did not understand the book. And that is why people need to understand the content that they're consuming, not just kind of blindly consume it. And I know that sounds boring, but it's really not. I think it's great fun to really analyze what it is that you're watching or reading. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm just a nerd, but I think it's great fun to do that instead of just consuming stuff blindly. And I wish more people would do that, because I see a lot of people with very bad media literacy skills these days. A lot.
Absolutely. And I think this is a perfect end to a very, very good episode on a topic
Thank you.
that everyone knows about, but now we have a better idea and a new discussion going forward. I want to give a huge thank you to my guest, Professor Meredith Walker, for coming back on the show. And Meredith, before we end today, are there any announcements you'd like to make to share the viewers and listeners? Any episodes coming up? Any papers you've written? Any conferences we can look forward to in the future?
Yeah, I'm working on a chapter right now for a book called Pop Culture Made Me Do It, which will probably not be out until next year. That's going to be really interesting. I wrote an essay about writing my master's thesis on Star Trek during COVID, which I had a lot of fun writing. So that's going to be out probably next year. It takes a long time. Traditional publishing takes a long time. And also, I've got several episodes coming up on my podcast, Bitchy History. So I've got an episode coming up on. I just finished an episode on child labor laws in America, which I think was really fun. I've also got an episode coming up on advertising and the way that it views women's bodies. I've got an episode on the history of birth control, episode on the history of school choice. Several things coming up pretty soon, and really, really fun. I'm not sure exactly when this is going to be, but I'm going to have a guest episode with Gwen Levy and the Gwen Levy and the Breakdown. We're doing an episode on what I call murder country, which is the kind of country music where the woman decides to kill her husband instead of waiting for the cops to handle him, which I think is going to be very fun. So I've got my Substack, obviously, where I write, which is just bitchyhistory.com. So if you guys want to follow that, and I had one other thing. Oh yeah, talking about media literacy, somebody on TikTok told me that I should turn some of my content on media literacy into a YouTube video. So that's gonna come out eventually. I'm gonna talk about how to analyze media, through critical theory. So that'll be fun. I think it's not gonna come out soon. I have to work on that video quite a bit to get it out, but I think that'll be a fun one. So
awesome. And where can people find and engage with you on social media?
Yeah, so bitchyhistory.com is the place to find everything. That's where my podcast is at. It's where my Substack is. Also, you can find me on TikTok at Professor Meredith. That's my account on there. That's also my username on Instagram, but I don't really use that for much. So you can follow me there pretty easily. And subscribe to my podcast. It's on all the major podcast channels. And that's where you can find me online.
I'll link all of them below in the description of this video, as well as tag Meredith's first interview here on the channel right over here. Make sure to give it a watch because it was a fun one. Thank you, viewers and listeners, for joining us for another episode of the Historians Lounge series. And again, a huge thank you to Meredith for coming back on the show, making her second appearance on the channel. And definitely, as I said before, it will not be the last. Who knows? Maybe I'll do a special where it'll be a double historians interview. Never know. Just make sure to follow. Make sure to follow both of us to keep up to date with all of our content. And as always, make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what was your favorite part of the episode. And as a bonus, what show did you watch growing up that now viewing it as an adult really makes you reconsider what it was about? Comment down below because I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. Until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day.